Imagine this. You wake up one morning, you look in the mirror, and maybe this quiet thought creeps in. Your life isn't quite where you pictured it would be, is it? Perhaps you're not as fit as you want, or that side project you started. Well, it just isn't really moving forward. And it's so easy then to feel like, oh, you're unmotivated, or maybe even lazy, right? But what if the truth is actually, well, simpler and maybe more empowering? What if you've just been unconsciously building these, let's call them less than ideal habits, kind of brick by brick, without even realizing the impact? See, the core idea we're digging into today is this. Your habits really fundamentally shape your identity, and that identity, in turn, shapes your whole future. So, we're taking a deep dive into this whole idea, drawing a lot from Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a book that promises, well, maybe not a shortcut exactly, but a path to massive success. Not through huge efforts, but tiny, consistent actions. Specifically, those little 1% improvements that can seriously reshape your life.
Right. And it's really not about summoning some, grand flash of willpower. Let's be honest, that's usually not sustainable anyway.
Yeah.
What Clear really unpacks, I think, are the powerful, almost invisible mechanics behind it all. The compounding effect. He helps us see how those tiny daily actions, the ones you barely notice when you do them consistently, they can snowball into really quite remarkable life-altering results.
Yeah.
It really pushes back against that idea that you need some massive effort for major change.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that compounding idea a bit more. Clear kicks things off, showing this raw power of tiny changes. The compound effect of habits, it's kind of like compound interest, in finance, but applied to how we behave. Your habits, good or bad, they just multiply their effects as you repeat them, day after day. He uses this really striking example. If you just improve by 1% every single day for a year. By the end of that year, you'll actually get this 37 times better than when you started.
37 times. It sounds almost unbelievable.
It does. But that's the math. But, and here's the flip side, right? If you decline by just 1% every day, you pretty much wipe yourself out, almost down to zero. So what's the takeaway for us? It means success isn't really about those huge overnight transformations we often chase. It's about these small, almost invisible actions, repeated consistently until they snowball into something big.
Yeah, and this principle, you see it echoed in behavioral economics research too. It genuinely shifts the focus. Instead of just hoping for that sudden breakthrough moment, you realize that consistent incremental effort is the real engine. It really highlights how the most powerful changes are often the ones we barely notice in the short term, but they accumulate like crazy over time. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? If this 1% thing works so well for us personally, how could it reshape how we tackle bigger things, like organizational change or even community building, areas where we often look for that big revolution, not the slow evolution?
That's a really interesting challenge. It makes you rethink what progress even looks like sometimes. Okay, so here's where it gets really practical and honestly quite interesting. Clear gives us his famous 4 laws framework. It's for building good habits and for breaking bad ones. So the first law is make it obvious. This is all about intentionally designing your environment, your surroundings, so your good habits are basically triggered automatically. Want to read more? Okay, put a book right there on your pillow each morning. Easy. Want to eat healthier? Keep fruit visible on the counter, not hidden in some drawer. It taps directly into that cue-based behavior thing our brains do. We're always scanning for cues, so if you control the cues, you can pretty much control the habits. Sounds almost too simple, doesn't it?
It does sound simple. And maybe that's where people sometimes get tripped up. Because, okay, making it obvious is powerful. Our brains are wired for those cue action links. But what happens when your environment is just constantly throwing bad cues at you? And you maybe can't fully redesign it. Think about an open plan office or just a busy house with kids. How do you make it obvious when you feel like you're swimming upstream against the environment you're stuck in?
That's a really fair point. And Clear does acknowledge it's maybe less about perfect control and more about strategically removing friction for the good stuff and adding friction for the bad stuff. He'd likely argue that even small tweaks can build momentum. You don't have to change everything at once. And actually, that leads right into the second law. Make it attractive. Our brains love rewards, right? We're wired to chase pleasure. So the idea is you pair the habit you want to build with something you genuinely enjoy. He calls it temptation bundling. Maybe you only allow yourself to listen to your absolute favorite podcast while you're exercising. Your brain pretty quickly starts to associate that workout with the pleasure of the podcast.
Yeah, and what's really clever there is how it taps into our brain's reward system, like you said. By deliberately linking something you want with something you maybe should do, you're essentially hijacking that dopamine response, that little pleasure hit. You're using it to make the habit itself feel more appealing, more desirable. So it's less about forcing yourself and more about kind of changing how you feel about the activity itself.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How you can sort of trick your brain into liking things. Okay, then there's the third law. Make it easy. This is all about reducing friction. Just remove as many steps as possible between you and doing the good habit. So if you want to practice guitar more, don't keep it packed away in its case in the back of the closet. Keep it out on a stand right there in the living room, ready to go. Every single tiny bit of effort you remove makes it that much more likely the habit will actually happen.
It's optimizing for convenience, definitely. But it's also about getting around our willpower, which we often overestimate, right? We think, oh, I'll just decide to do the hard thing. But if you make the path of least resistance, well, you don't need that constant motivation. Although it's interesting, some other research, particularly in motivational psychology, it suggests that sometimes a tiny bit of friction, especially right at the start of forming a habit, can actually signal its importance to our brains. It makes us value it more, stick with it longer. How do we balance making it easy with making sure the habit still feels, meaningful, not just a mindless task?
That's a brilliant question. Yeah, it's not about making it so effortless it becomes meaningless. Clear would probably argue that you make it easy to start, get the repetition going. Then, once the habit is established, maybe then you can layer on more challenge or meaning. Make it progressively harder. And that brings us to the fourth law. Make it satisfying. Immediate rewards are incredibly powerful for locking in behavior. Our brains love that instant feedback. Think about like visually tracking your habits, maybe putting an X on a calendar every day you do the thing. That little X, it gives you a small hit of dopamine, a tiny celebration, and that encourages you to keep the streak going.
Right, that immediate feedback loop is just crucial. Our brains are wired for instant gratification, not so much for delayed rewards. Providing that little burst of satisfaction right after you do the habit dramatically increases the odds you'll do it again tomorrow. But okay, this raises a big question for me. What about habits where the real payoff is years down the line? Things like saving for retirement or maybe learning a complex skill like a new language. Does Clear talk about how to stay motivated when you don't get that immediate dopamine hit?
Mhm.
Where's the satisfaction then?
He definitely does, and this really gets to one of Clear's most powerful ideas, I think, which is that true, lasting habit change is actually identity change. See, most people set outcome-based goals, like I want to run a marathon or I want to lose 10 pounds, and those outcomes are fine, they're great even. But if you only focus on the outcome, you're kind of missing the deeper point. Instead, Clear says you should focus on becoming the kind of person who runs every day, or the kind of person who never misses a workout. It's about who you are.
Hmm. That really shifts the internal conversation, doesn't it? It goes from chasing external achievement to affirming an internal state. So instead of saying, I'm trying to quit smoking, you frame it as, I am not a smoker. When your habits become tied to that deeper sense of self, who you believe you are, they become incredibly reinforcing. You stop trying to do something and you start being the person who naturally does it. That core belief makes the actions feel almost automatic, inevitable. But what if someone genuinely identifies as, say, a procrastinator? Or maybe just inherently messy? How does this framework suggest someone starts to shift an identity they might have held for, like, decades? Especially when those identities feel so, real.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you break down those really deep-seated self-perceptions? Clear's approach is basically you prove it to yourself with tiny actions, small wins. Each time you do something that aligns with the new identity, even something really small, it's like casting a vote for that new identity. Enough votes, and the scale starts to tip. You start to believe it. And the beauty is, those same four laws we talked about, they work perfectly in reverse to help you ditch bad habits. You want to make it invisible, remove the cues that trigger the bad habit. Get rid of the junk food in the house. You make it unattractive, constantly remind yourself of the negative consequences. Think about why you want to stop. You make it difficult, add friction. Make the bad habit harder to do. Put the remote control in another room. And finally, you make it unsatisfying, create some kind of accountability partner or an immediate downside, maybe a habit contract. So if you're always wasting time on your phone, maybe you delete the tempting apps or just leave your phone in another room when you need to focus.
Right. So zooming out, it's essentially about engineering your environment and your mindset to make the bad stuff as inconvenient and unappealing as possible. It's definitely not about just gritting your teeth and using sheer willpower, which, as we know from other research too, is a pretty limited resource. It's more about building systems that gently nudge you away from what you don't want to do. Maybe even create a slight feeling of aversion towards it.
Exactly. And here's another really common hurdle, a trap that Claire talks about quite a bit. The plateau of latent potential. So many people quit. I know I have because they just don't see results fast enough. Clear calls this that plateau. It's that really frustrating period where you feel like you're putting in the work day after day, but nothing seems to be happening. It feels invisible right before, potentially, the breakthrough comes.
Well, it's such a relatable feeling, isn't it? That sense of, is this even working?
Hmm.
Think about ice melting is a great analogy he uses. At, say, 31 degrees Fahrenheit or minus zero point 0.5 Celsius, nothing looks like it's happening. You're
Right.
putting energy in, the temperature is rising slowly, but it's still just ice. But then, right at 32 degrees 0 Celsius, boom, it suddenly turns to water. That change wasn't sudden at all, was it? The energy, the effort, it was building up the whole time, just unseen. The breakthrough is really the result of all those previous efforts that didn't seem to pay off immediately. It really shows that counterintuitive thing about progress. Often the effort is linear, but the results, it can be exponential.
So true. So, what does all this mean for how we should, actually approach making changes in our lives? Clears argues that goals are super useful. They set your direction, point you where you want to go. Absolutely essential. But it's the systems you build that actually determine if you make progress. For instance, your goal may be write a book, great goal. But your system is the process. Maybe writing 500 words every weekday morning. Or your goal is get fit, but your system is going to the gym Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday.
Hmm.
Systems create that sustainable process. Without them, you're just constantly chasing results, maybe getting them temporarily, but it's like being on a hamster wheel.
That distinction is so important between the outcome you desire and the actual process that gets you there. You don't just magically become a writer because you set the goal. You become one because you have a consistent system for writing. It really is about building the engine, isn't it? Not just staring at the map of where you want to end up. It's a fantastic reminder that real achievement usually comes from that consistent input day in and day out, not just having a big, ambitious destination in mind.
Right. So, wrapping this up, after this deep dive, I think the core philosophy of Atomic Habits should be pretty clear. It's really less about finding some superhuman motivation and much more about strategically designing your life. Designing it so the right actions happen more naturally, almost automatically, without having to rely constantly on sheer willpower. And as James Clear powerfully puts it in his closing, and this quote really sticks with you, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems.
That's powerful. And as you listening reflect on everything we've discussed today, not just from Atomic Habits, but maybe other ideas about behavior we touched on, think about what specific insight really stood out for you. Was it maybe the power of designing your environment, or that idea of temptation bundling, or maybe the identity piece? What single tiny atomic habit might you consider starting, maybe even today? Or what existing system in your life could you tweak just slightly? Tweak it to make the good stuff easier and the less helpful stuff a bit harder. Really try to embrace that power of consistent incremental change, because your future self, they're really just the sum total of all the small actions you take or don't take starting right now. So what are you going to build, brick by tiny brick, that truly lines up with the person you genuinely want to become?